Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. Now, two modes of sense-making that I have relied heavily on through most of my life has been reading books and listening to thoughtful people talk about ideas. However, if you've been listening to Good Faith recently, you might notice that I've recently been devoting more episodes to another mode of sense-making, which is music. And it's because I'm increasingly convinced that God designed us to make sense of the world also through music. And for Christians, we have access, in fact, called to a particular kind of music, which is musical worship. So for this episode, I wanted to explore how musical worship functions as a sense-making activity for Christians. And then relatedly, how are our contemporary worship music and practices, how are they helping or not helping us in this sense-making activity? And I had just the perfect guest for this, which is Andy Crouch. Andy is the regular at Good Faith and my go-to friend for many topics, but especially anything related to music. So Andy, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you, Curtis.
Can you do the rest of this entire episode as an operatic kind of theme? That would be impressive. I will not be doing that.
Very happy to get to talk and sing with you. We'll just break into song at appropriate moments. Yeah,
I'll just throw out different genres throughout the talk. Like, Andy, do rap now. Andy, 17th century arias. All right. So, no, the reason why I thought Andy would be a great guest is, in addition to him being a wonderful singer himself, is that Andy himself has practiced these different modes of sense making that I've talked about. He has written books that I have found very helpful to read. He has given talks that I found very helpful to listen to. In fact, just a few weeks ago, I listened to another Andy Crouch talk at the Praxis conference, which was just a lovely experience, both the conference and Andy's closing talk. But in addition, Andy also has led Christians in musical worship. So Andy, can we start by you unpacking for yourself your own experience of these three different modes of sense making and you helping other people, your audience, make sense of the world through what's different about books, about talks, and then about worship?
Wow. Well, two things immediately rise, I think, to our attention. One is that if we're talking specifically about worship is the work of activating our consciousness of the presence of God as a primary reality in a way that the typical book does not. Now, there is a kind of devotional writing that has exactly this purpose. But so there's, worship specifically is about, for Christians, what we believe is God is present, bidden, or unbidden. So it's not like we're invoking or kind of compelling the God to show up. The creator God is present all the time. So it's really much more about directing our attention very actively in everything we do to the presence of God for those who gather in worship in Jesus' name, which of course Jesus specifically authorizes by saying, when two or three are gathered in my name, I'm there. So worship is about accessing, activating, enhancing, in a sense. These are tricky words, by the way, which is why I'm choosing them carefully. But moving towards an experience of that reality, or at least life and action in light of that reality. Yeah. The other thing, if we're talking specifically about the role music plays in worship, is there's just something very self-evidently present in a kind of dominant way, you might say, in music that is only latent in books and in speaking, and that is emotion. So what music specifically does is, by harnessing, to some extent, human neurology, grounded ultimately in some very elemental properties of physics, and by creating areas of tension and areas of resolution, and by creating a kind of rhythm of experience of tension and resolution, and playing that out through time, sometimes, depending on the kind of music, a very long amount of time, it it plays on the strings of the heart, and it activates your emotion, which is why music that has no words, it's very hard to pin down what it communicates, but whatever it is communicating is emotion.
Yep.
And so music heightens the emotional register of communication far more than these other media do, even though speech specifically, so speech is what we call untuned voicing. So when I sang "Thank you, Curtis," that's pitched. It's pitched. It's on specific pitches of the Western scale. But actually, what I'm doing as I speak is I'm modulating frequency, not according to specific pitches, but I'm absolutely varying from low to high. I just did it. It's very hard to do it consciously, for
Right.
emphasis, for emotion. If I were to stop doing that, it would sound very flat like this. I'm basically trying to create a barely pitched, but not at all modulated sound right now. And when I do that, the emotion disappears from my voice. And writers, of course, try to do this. We've only got words on the page to work with. And some books really don't attempt it at all or barely attempt it. And other books attempt it very, very, are very serious about trying to create an emotional effect in the reader. But music does it without even having to try. So, so, what's going on when we add music to worship and when we do music in worship, we are directing our attention to the presence of God. And we're doing so in a way that is just like mainlining into our capacity for emotion, which is maybe, I got this idea from Rosalind Picard at MIT. Emotion really is our most flexible and robust cognitive resource that we have as human beings. It's far more cognitively important than reasoning or than speech or language. It can encompass more experience, emotion can, than anything else. And so if we are trying to experience the presence of the ultimate, we need the resources of emotion to access the ultimate, which is why music and worship, not just in Christian history, but in almost every religion, kind of go together.
So that's really interesting. It strikes me then that it's very much this mode of sense making that is attuned to our very bodily nature. The fact that we are wired, like you said, even neurologically, to respond emotionally in our body to these different pitches and so forth. Why is accessing emotion then, say more about this, why emotion is the more encompassing of meaning, because I think that's probably where the clue is to why music is so important. What does emotion capture about God and God's presence in the world that books and talks don't?
Wow. I don't know if I can answer this. It's such a mystery, right? But I think that emotion and the kind of emotion that's accessed through music can encompass a wider range of realities than are easily put into words. I mean, this is why I'm hesitating. Like, if we were to, we could interstitially put in 2 minutes of Beethoven or 2 minutes of rap or anything, and you would feel far more than we can say, right?
Yeah.
And there's just more to our own experience of the world than we can ever say. And music, among other things, allows us to experience even multiple things at the same time to some extent. So, it can register a whole lot of different kinds of experience, at least in very quick juxtaposition, such that you find yourself swept away by it, tearing up in response to it, not necessarily because it's sad, sometimes because it's beautiful. But of course, the beautiful and the sad are very connected. And music can do both of those. And when we talk about the beautiful, it's very hard to capture in words the sadness or the tragedy of the beautiful. And yet when you do that in music, people just immediately feel it. And so, I think the immediacy is a big part of it, and the analog nature of it, you might say. So, if you think of analog signals as ones that have infinite variability, that is, they don't break down into discrete parts. Our language is made up of these discrete units of meaning, really, that we call phonemes, that are assembled into syllables, assembled into words. And they are, it's more like digital communication in the sense that you're breaking things up into parts and then putting it back together to make sense. Whereas music is this analog reality, particularly when experienced in person, in present, in the actual presence of other people and the music makers, that is just continuously varying in such a way that it encompasses so much more information than we can certainly put into language. And by the way, this is another really important distinction. There was a really interesting study The Economist reported on not that long ago. I don't have it right in front of me, but the essence of it was that live musicians are paying attention in a kind of resonant way to the response of their audience, and just naturally vary and adjust their performance to resonate with the kind of mental and emotional state of their audience in a way that you cannot do when you're in a recording studio. So recorded music, though it can be very excellent and very moving, always falls short of the interpersonal or intersubjective dimension of live music. And worship music, until extremely recently, has always been an entirely live experience. And actually, it's a really interesting transition when we start making it like a recording. And there's one way to do that, there's this thing called, I can't remember what the brand name is, but it's like music tracks for small churches that don't always have professional musicians. So you can like have the bass player come in for, if you don't have a bass player, or keyboard, or, whichever parts you're missing, the other people play along with it. But of course, the recorded thing like runs the show.
Right, because everybody's tuning off of that. Yeah.
You're singing 10,000 Reasons or whichever worship song, was licensed, and you're actually just playing recorded music. And that's a profoundly different musical experience than live musicians. But then the other thing that happens, even if all your band is live, is once you have in-ears, which is to say, this is the way a lot of monitoring is done, so you can hear the other band members. People use these in-ear monitors. Those cut the musicians off from the congregation, and they're only listening. The musicians are only listening to each other, much more in the way you would at a recording studio. There's still resonance there, but it's only between the members of the band. And these innovations are, let's just say, they aren't necessarily great for responding to the presence of God who's there when two or three are gathered. We could probably talk more about that, but
we are going to talk more about that, because I think what you're already creeping into is this idea of how has modern technological worship practices, musical worship practices in churches, what is it doing to this power, this unique power of musical worship? We definitely want to unpack that. But first I want to go back to something you talked about music's ability to encompass a very broad range of emotions and make sense of it all in simultaneously or in quick juxtaposition. When you were describing that, it suddenly thought, oh, that makes sense of the Psalms for me, because when I read the Psalms and I read it as text, sometimes it's a very odd experience, because the text is moving from one reality of praising God to despairing of God to smite my enemies to I love you, God, and I have mercy, God. It's like, and when as text, it feels like this is all over the place. But
yes, totally.
Right. But when I think about, wait, these were songs. This was originally meant to be experienced in music live with other people, going through these up and downs of emotions, oftentimes in immediate juxtaposition with one another. If I experience that the way the original audience met, it might actually make more sense to me, and also help me make more sense of the world that is filled with all of these juxtapositions of rage, despair, to joy, to celebration, to hope. So it strikes me that the scripture itself testifies to what you're talking about.
Amazing. And it is worth, just laying down the marker that musical worship specifically is like very, very intrinsic to both Jewish and Christian experience of God and response to God. above all, in these 150 songs,
Yeah.
all of which originally had tunes. By the time of Jesus, not necessarily the original tunes, but Jesus and his disciples are still singing those songs or versions of them. When they had sung a hymn, it says they went out to the Mount of Olives. That is almost certainly one of the psalms that they sing. I don't know which one. And then
Yeah.
right away, the first Christians start to develop their own songs, and we have fragments of them probably, like Philippians 2, probably is it's sometimes called the Song of Christ. Though he was in very nature God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped. That seems to be in the form of a psalm/song
Right.
that the early Christians sang. Yeah, so it's there many more times in the text than we realize when we read it as a book.
Right.
Yeah, and once you realize people really do sing their way through life,
Yeah.
then it makes sense that the ultimate kind of the life that really is life would be a very musical experience and expression, corporately and individually.
And the other marker I want to lay down is, I'm talking about music as a way, and worship music as a way we make sense of the world. I think some people might immediately say, well, no, worship isn't about making sense of the world. It's about God. It's about focusing on God. And here's where I want to lay out the worship you see most in Scripture is about a God active in the world. I mean, occasionally you get a picture of a worship that seems to be like in the heavens, sort of, in a sense, disconnected from the world. But I think even there, we're not fully embracing the Jewish worldview in which the heavens and the earth are interlocking realities, so that even the picture of God in the heavens is not a picture divorced of the world.
No.
It's like a peeling back the curtain on the world to see that God is actually active and present, even in invisible ways. And so, I want to just say, when I say music worship makes sense of the world, it is making sense because God is active and present in the world. And if our God is indeed the creator, redeemer God of the world, to make sense of the world is to make sense of this God's work in the world. And so this is why I think worship music should be understood as sense making of the world, right?
Yes, but in the second person, not the third person primarily. So in other words, I think that's the other reason people might resist is, well, it's not just talking about the world. Indeed, it's not, because actually to properly engage the meaning of the world is to turn in prayer and praise to God and speak to God, not just about God or about the world. So, the Psalms are like this too. They can function descriptively, but they always do that they kind of turn back, mostly in every individual psalm and certainly in the whole of the Psalms. Like, it's always back to, we're actually going to talk to this God now.
Yeah.
We're going to talk to you, not just talk about him, or, however you'd say it. Yeah.
So Andy, when you then are preparing and then indeed engaging in music worship leading of a audience, what do you have to do? What do you have to make sure your mindset is right, or your heart is set, that may be different from when you are preparing to give a talk or you're sitting down to write a book? What is it about that experience? Because you're starting to get that a little bit about how it seems like one of it is that you've got to be able to hear your audience. You've got to be able to connect with your audience, because something about that's happening is a common exchange of emotions that is part of the sense making. What else is involved in this?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. So I'll tell you the order that things come to mind, and I don't know if this is good or not. I'll just tell you what I think I actually do, which is, the very first thing I have to think about is, what music can this group make together? So there are multiple considerations here. There's what's in their repertoire. So, one of the beautiful things about Christian worship is we have a common repertoire of songs that we can turn to. Some of them are relatively old, like Amazing Grace would be maybe the best known, rather old text. The tune is newer. The tune is maybe 2 centuries old. The text is 3 or 4 centuries old. And so, what's in their repertoire? Because I'll tell you what's there. It's not impossible, but what's hard to do in worship is we're meant to be kind of, in a sense, emptying ourselves of self and turning our attention and kind of being absorbed in the reality of God's presence. And to do that while you're learning a completely new thing, there's limits to our ability to do that. So I might be able to teach you a new song, but it had better sound like something you've heard before. If I tried to teach you to sing Indian ragas, which are the like very long, microtonal improvisational lines that make up the music of a lot of South Asia. Like if I take a 12-tone Western audience, I'm like, here to worship God. Now I just need to teach you how to do microtones. So like listen to the difference between C and C half sharp. I mean, there's no way we can cross that many. There are some physical barriers. There are also, to be more practical, it's something a lot of worship leaders think about, but not enough leaders think about, which is that the untrained human voice has about an octave range, and it's roughly from what we call C to C, lower C to high C, middle C for women, C below middle C for men. And if I ask you as the congregation to sing very much outside of that range, I'm asking you to do something that's really, really kind of uncomfortable and distractingly so. And I have to kind of adjust my expectations or, plan my music with what has this congregation learned to sing, and how have they learned to sing? So there's like these technical, and what's available to us musically that we can work with, and that varies tremendously by culture and by church tradition and by generation. And the first job of the musician, I think, is to, or the worship leader as a musician, or the musician as worship leader, is to really pay attention to what can this congregation do, and then how do we stretch it? Because in music, as in these other forms of communication, the two things you have to be very, very, you have to have a horror of them, I would say, is cliche and sentimentality. So cliche is overly familiar truth, and sentimentality is unearned emotion, emotion that comes too easily, that doesn't kind of emerge out of authentic experience, but just is kind of wrung out of you by manipulation, you might say, a kind of manipulation. And so I have to be thinking both with the words and the text, like what will be truthful for this congregation to sing, and what emotions are truthful for us to express. And often that involves stretching beyond what we see. Once we've already expressed it a lot, Amazing Grace is a big problem in this respect. Like everybody knows the text, everybody knows the tune. It's extremely familiar. So either like explicitly or implicitly, I have to be thinking as a musician, how do we stretch this so that it is new again when we do it? Rather than just, we sing Amazing Grace every third service and we all know how it goes. We all know how it feels, because that's actually not going to open us up the way it needs to. I'm not sure I've given you the whole list, but those are like, so there's this very technical thing, like what's the range of the songs? Yeah. What songs are in the sort of shared songbook? If I'm going to introduce a new one, how do I do it in such a way that it starts with what people already know and takes them one step further? But then with the things that people already know, how do I make it new for this moment? And there's so many dimensions you can work with as a musician. There's arrangement. There's other things that you kind of introduce at the same time as you're singing. One of my favorite things to do that I wish I could just, if someone made me czar of all worship music in the United States, because I don't want the responsibility for the rest of the world.
Okay, a limited czardom. Okay,
yeah, right. I would reintroduce the reading of Psalms, since we don't know their tunes, alongside the singing of Psalms, and I would intersperse. So I just did this on Sunday. We sang this amazing, incredible hymn, "The Church's One Foundation," which has this incredible text, very, very beautiful tune that traditionally goes with it. But in between verses, we read Psalm 22, which is the psalm that begins, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It takes us all the way to the dust of death and then back to the hope of posterity, hearing about the Lord. And the two, when you do the two intertwined, you hear things in each one that you never would hear if you just sang through the hymn or just read through the psalm. Yeah. And I'm always looking as a musician for those unexpected ways to get into what the feeling that is potentially there, that's not the easy feeling or the obvious feeling.
I don't know if you've been are like me, but as Andy is talking about I've been like, yeah, that doesn't totally describe my experience every Sunday. So let's break that down. Why is that? And in particular, Andy, I want you to kind of go beyond like the limitations of any specific individual worship leader and talk about what has happened like globally.
Though we could discuss that.
Yes. You, Maria, out there. No, we're not going to do that. And let's just say it at the outset, music worship leading, I find, is a hard gig. I mean, to do what you're talking about, to lead people into the presence of God.
This
led, the biblical sort of practitioners into quaking and shaking about of how serious of a task this was. So this is why I don't want to talk about this about like, as a complaint about, well, I wish my worship leader did more of X or Y. I want to talk about this more of like, what are some global phenomena? And I think especially the music industry, the Christian music industry, what has that done to our experience of music worship, such that, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, when they describe what you're talking about, they're like, yeah, I don't know. You're not quite describing what I experience every Sunday.
Yeah. So a couple things have happened. And one, I think maybe a very fundamental one is the phrase "to play music" has completely changed its music over the past, its meaning over the past 100 years. Which is to say that before 100 years ago, if you said, let's play some music, the only thing it could mean was someone's going to pick up an instrument or sit down at an instrument, or we'll just use the instruments of our bodies, and we human beings together will make sound bound to time. It will come into being and it will go out of being, and we'll have made music. And that's, in a sense, the active sense of playing music. And then about 100 years ago, the gramophone is invented, and now streaming music and other things are invented, YouTube and so forth. And now the 90, I don't know how many nines to put after this, the vast majority of music that is played today is actually replayed. That is, it was recorded once, and now we're replaying it through amplification and in our earbuds and so forth. And what this has led to, or gone along with, at least, I guess I don't know for sure what the causation is a collapse of amateur music making, so that many, many people now would say they are not musical, even though it's extremely rare to have someone who cannot learn music if they're exposed to it early, because it's actually more foundational in some ways than speech. Arguably, song came before speech in human history, and it comes before it in a way in our neurological preparation. But now there's many, many people who have never had a chance to develop the making of music as their own ability. And at the same time, there's been some real incentives for people who discover a talent for it to become kind of professional music makers. So you have this division that there have always been very, very talented people, some of whom made their living making music, or at least this has been true for quite a while in different ways in different places. But it used to be a collective activity. Even what we call the classical music repertoire, if you think of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven as like the heart of the classical repertoire, much of what they wrote was not intended for public performance by professional musicians, but was actually written often for patrons. This was aristocratic, admittedly, people who in their own homes would make this music with their friends, sometimes with a few professionals sitting in to make sure it didn't fall apart. And at the same time, of course, as that was happening in the mansion or the manor or whatever, in the town, people were gathering in the pub or wherever you gathered, the gathering place, quite outside of church, and just making music, like the folk music, right? So what we have now is a handful of people are really good at this, and we give them the microphones and we give them the recording devices, and they make music on the behalf of all of us. But that means that when we come together in worship, you have this huge asymmetry between the people who are comfortable having a microphone put in front of them, and the people who say, "Oh, I don't sing or I don't make music."
Right.
You've got this massive breakdown of the resonance that's meant to happen when people sing together, and that was absolutely taken for granted. This had nothing to do. Now, the kind of music had something to do with, say, class or station, and in fact, there were kinds of music that only upper class people made or only working class people made. But everyone made music together until 100 years ago, and now almost no one does, except people who are like, music is my thing. So that's the most fundamental like development. And then and there's a recent like 30-year subcomponent to this, which is the elimination for the sake of preparation for standardized testing of musical instruction in schools. So it used to be that part of a public education in the United States was music, and people learned to read music. They often were required to be part of the school choir. I'm not saying everybody enjoyed it.
I was just at the tail end of this, actually.
Yes, right. Well, it's over. It's over.
Yeah.
These programs are now for it's a very similar thing has happened in sports. Like you play around as a kid, but then like at age 10, you specialize and you never go back. Like you either do travel sports or you don't do sports at all.
Right.
And you either do like show choir or chamber choir or orchestra, which is a very small minority of kids, or else you're totally out of music for the rest of your schooling. And that just wasn't true until, really about a generation ago. So when our poor worship leaders arrive to lead us in musical worship, we got to have some sympathy for what they're dealing with, which is that the congregation is not prepared to make music together. Like they haven't done it at home. They haven't done it as part of their extended family. A really vivid illustration of this is the national anthem at sporting events. When I was a kid, most of the sporting events I went to, the crowd sang the Star Spangled Banner. Very badly, I want to say. Semi-badly, especially that Rockets Red Glare, pretty tough to reach that note. That's usually a fifth
above the C octave.
The
C.
Right. Now I don't think I've been to a sporting event in 20 years where the crowd sang with no assistance or with just an organ or recording playing the sort of the accompaniment.
They're now passively listening to a performance at the beginning.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Maybe mouthing along the words. That's exactly what's happening in worship. People are mouthing along the words, minimally participating in many, many places, not everyone. Okay, so that's one big thing. The other big thing is, and I get this from Ken Myers, this really wonderful journalist that I'm sure you and many listeners know of. He wrote a really good book, the exact title of which escapes me now, but something like All God's Children in Blue Suede Shoes, I think was the title. Yep. And it's about kind of the history of music and art making, but he calls attention to three kind of streams of music, which I'll call at least high culture, which is kind of what we think of in music as classical music in the West. This is what was made by Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven for aristocratic patrons. Then there's folk culture, which is just the music that emerges usually anonymously. This would encompass, everything from Irish jigs to Negro spirituals from different places and times. We're just out of the expression of being people together in the pre-recorded music era. People make music that just gets passed on and kind of adopted and adapted over time. But a third form of music arises with recording, and that's commercial music. And that's music that is fundamentally made to sell, and that over time, in a sense, it is optimized to sell. So it has very, very understandable hooks and kind of memorable, catchy tunes. And, this starts with the Gershwin brothers writing in New York's Tin Pan Alley. But it really takes off with recording. It's now literally like a factory system that like mixes and remixes little pieces of music until you find the like commercially viable version. Right. And this is the dominant form of music now. But it's like the furthest of the three from being designed to facilitate that resonant encounter with each other. That is the essence. That's like the beginning of the resonant encounter with God, who is present with us. But it is also the model for a lot of the music that's made and sold as worship music. And it's really significant to say sold. Now, people have made music, have made a certain amount of money publishing Christian hymns and so forth for about 150 years. But the commercialization of Christian worship is quite an amazing thing. And part of what happened is that that's centered in Nashville, the Nashville Christian music industry. When I was a kid, I came to faith as a teenager, and I discovered these Christian bands. I was living way up in New England. No one else knew about these bands. I was like Petra's only fan.
I was going to say, is this Petra?
This is Petra. Okay, yeah. God bless the guys at Petra. I was a 13-year-old trying to find my way to faith, and here's some people singing about faith. So yeah. I'll listen, right? And they sound like the radio, except, well, they sound more or less like the radio. They sound like the radio a few years earlier. There's always a bit of a lag. But, those were not worship songs. Petra and all that whole generation, Amy Grant or, whoever you're like your pop music artist, they sang about faith, but they didn't sing worship music that was designed for congregational worship. Essentially what happened about maybe 15 or 20 years ago is that the labels that hire these people realized the market was much bigger for music that would purport to take place in the context of worship, that is sort of transparently for worship. And the whole industry and its financial incentives got attached to making worship, to kind of making music to express worship.
Yeah.
I know some of these musicians. I've been led in worship by some of them who have been very commercially successful. And I think many of them are amazing, sincere, and gifted musicians. And I don't think the commercialization is the problem per se, but it has separated the making of music from the congregation in a pretty significant way. These songs are now largely written in writing rooms with a number of people, all looking for that hook, all looking for, in a sense, the trick that will make the song work. And I'm not saying the result is unusable at all in genuine worship, but it's not emerging in the way that folk music definitely did. And in some ways that earlier generations of music did, out of just the actual experience of being in a congregation making music. There's exceptions, there's beautiful exceptions. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but all these things are playing into like what it feels like to worship in church today in most settings.
Yeah. Well, the calculus of writing those songs, like you just said, sounds so different than what you articulated earlier in the conversation of like the songwriters are not thinking, well, what's the musical repertoire of background of my audience? And how do I deliver something that's accessible to them that won't cause too much of a leap? And how do we keep within that octave range? And it's none of that, right? And the ethos, it seems to me, is really one that actually is designed, not just accidentally, but designed to separate you from the masses. Because it strikes me as what we pay for is virtuosity. That's what we're willing to pay for. So virtuosity, by definition, means only a select few people can actually achieve this. Well, and so the songs that are going to have that feeling of virtuosity are by definition the ones that I can't come up with my own, and in some ways I can't even really sing along very easily. I'll give you the commercial logic. Yeah.
The most clear example of this, and people who think a lot about worship music will immediately, they'll know what I'm going to say even before I say it. About 10 years ago, worship musicians, professional industry worship musicians, discovered this technique that can create a tremendous emotional effect, which is to start off in a very low octave register, low register with a melody. But then as the music kind of heightens in energy, to take it up an entire octave. So you're now singing the same tune. So one of the first songs to go really big with this, and many good things about this song, but this is not a good thing about it, I would say, is this song, You Make Beautiful Things Out of Dust. Forgive me for not remembering right off the top of my head the artist. I apologize. Well-known song, very moving song in certain ways. But it starts off very low, and then kind of as the chorus comes around, it moves an octave up, and it ends up requiring a range of, well over like at least an octave and a half, if not a little more. And the original artist who recorded it has this incredible upper tenor range that he's able to sing it in this quasi falsetto, and it's very authentic sounding and very powerful. And he's like one of 7 people in the world who can pull that off. And when a typical worship leader, when Maria, who we're not going to pick on,
Yeah.
is trying to pull this off, either at the beginning, she's so far out of her range on the low side that doesn't make sense, or more often it starts out reasonable. And then we're asking even the worship leader, it's painful to listen to.
Yeah.
Like you have to have very skinny jeans to get that note out. And let alone the congregation. The congregation can't go there. But this technique is now ubiquitous in modern worship music because, in one sense, because it works at an emotional level. It produces a heightened sense, but it also makes the congregation utterly dependent on a handful of relatively virtuosic singers who can at least fake that upper note. And it's, I hate to criticize any song or writer because most of the people I meet who do this, and a couple of them are truly friends of mine who do this at a kind of industry high level, like commercially successful level. They're good people seeking to serve the church, honestly. And they also end up making a very large amount of money, and they live in amazing houses. But, I don't necessarily begrudge them that. I don't begrudge artists making a living or even a good living. So I hate to criticize it, but it has become a cliche, and it's become sentimentality. It's a way to produce an emotional effect. But the biggest problem is it's pre-packaged. Right. It's a pre-packaged emotional experience that doesn't emerge out of an ecstatic environment of worship. I mean, I have been in places that are mostly not in the West, where in the course of a congregational worship experience, absolutely octaves get skipped and amazing vocal things happen in the kind of and I think it's fair to say that the genuine spontaneous response to God's presence, these are usually more Pentecostal-ish environments, charismatic environments, or just non-Western, kind of left brain first environments. And it's very real and powerful. But it's really different when it's all in the lead sheet and when you've got to make that move at that moment and when the congregation can't actually make it.
Yeah. Andy, we started this conversation by talking about how music is meant to help us make sense of the world. And it seems to me, if I were to summarize what you're describing in terms of these global phenomenon, is that music is actually putting us in very particular postures of how we engage with the world and make sense of the world. And so the picture I almost have of, a typical worship service is a massive chasm has opened up from the stage to the rest of the people sitting in the congregation, right?
Yeah.
And on the congregation side, they've been put in the posture of consumers. Yeah. They're passive, they're listening to something, they're might be, beating their, clapping a little bit, nodding here and there, but they're not singing full throated because they can't hit that note. And, and that the moves of the songs are just too complex for them to follow. And also, as you said, they've been detrained just by the culture to be active music makers themselves. So they're in consumer mode, which is a totally different way of making sense of the world than as a worshiper, how a worshiper makes sense of the world, right? The consumer has been just sitting back and like, well, what is this? What is in it for me? And in essence, the consumer posture is, I am kind of the little God here. My tastes and my desires are actually at, sort of what is held paramount in the consumer posture. And then you've got the worship leader who is put in the posture, not a consumer, a big God, right? A performer. Okay. Yeah. They're the big God. they're the performer, and they have all of the attention placed on them because they are the virtuoso who can actually either, if they're good, hit that note, or worse, they're like a failed God in that they can't hit that note. Everybody's cringing. So it just seems like this is awful, Andy. This is not what worship is meant to be. And yet, of course, God breaks through. God's Spirit is present whenever two or three gather. So even in sort of this sort of deeply flawed model, we're not saying worship doesn't happen. Of course, God's Spirit is more powerful, but we can do better, and we can be more faithful.
Yes, and we did in the past. I mean, a very simple thing is in many, many churches. Going back to the Catholic tradition, but many Protestant churches up until very recently, the choir, which was the musicians who led the congregation's worship, and the organ in many church buildings were in the back. The sound of the organ and the choir kind of emanated from the back of the sanctuary, kind of pushing its way through the congregation. The congregation's joining their voices with the choir. Sometimes there are sung parts that only the choir does, but then the congregation joins at certain points, and that all kind of flows toward the front to the altar, where we kind of are focusing our attention on God's presence. And that's such a different thing from the stage that creates this face-to-face encounter that actually makes it much harder. Like, where are we directing our attention if not to the attempt at expression of the worship leader, rather than the gathered voice that kind of directs itself towards the representation of God in the cross, or depending on the tradition, the communion table, or whatever. Yeah, so it could be better.
Well, and it strikes me it's not just the pure musical qualities that you've described, but it's a whole aesthetic that has now infiltrated Christian churches that comes from the concert performance environment. Like, how many churches do you go to that it's darkened room, lighting effects, very loud music that frankly even drowns out even the people who are able to sing.
If you sing, it doesn't matter. I mean,
it doesn't matter.
And they've got their in-ears. Even if your neighbors can hear you, they can't. Like, there is really, I have to say, I mean, I understand why people use in-ears. I sometimes use them when I'm on stage in certain settings, because it solved a problem that was hard to solve, which is monitoring. That's sort of a technical sidebar. But they distance you. And you'll see some musicians take out one of their in-ears when they really want to hear the people. And I feel like we almost ought to make that like mandatory. Like, you can have one in-ear, but not two. Because once you have two, you've lost the resonance with the room. Actually, you're just performing for the soundboard at that point. And you've definitely lost the resonance with the audience. Sorry, that was a bit of a digression.
No, it's so interesting.
It's not a small part of the technical panoply.
Right, because when you are trying to replicate, when your model is the performer in a concert, the Christian artist on stage performing in a concert, then everybody, including the sound technicians on Sunday morning, are sort of just mimicking that aesthetic. And so volume levels get turned up such that, like exactly like you said, the musicians can't actually hear even each other without these devices that separate them from the congregation. And then the congregation can't hear each other sing because the music volume is blasted so loud. And it's all dark, and so you feel alone. You can't even see who's here or who's not here. Just like a concert, like where you are an individual, anonymous, consumer and participant. Okay, so we're painting this sort of bleak picture of musical worship. We're not going to end here, listeners. We're going to talk about how to move forward from here, but we're going to do that right after we hear from our sponsors. All right, we're back with Andy Crouch, and we've been talking about the state of Christian worship and how actually very recently, and I think it's actually helpful to underline this, that we're talking about certain very powerful dynamics, but are actually fairly recent, like in the last 10 or 20 years, that have reshaped and, from our perspective, deformed Christian worship in a way that is much more commercial, distancing, consumer-oriented, performer-centric, and so forth. So, Andy, it seems like a lot of these drivers are through the powers of, industry, commercialization, technology, and the deep culture that gets driven by all of these forces. What's the way forward? Because it doesn't seem like, I'm going to just hazard a guess, like we can't go back exactly to, the ways we were, but we probably need to borrow, or we need to recover some things from the past and then reform it for the future. What could this look like?
Yeah, I actually think there's a lot of room for movement, and I think there's some hunger for it. I will say I'm a little daunted at how much, like, a lot of American Christians seem to kind of like the worship concert and be very happy kind of swaying along. I think it's a very, it's a fearful thing to come into the presence of the living God. And if someone will mediate that for me, I might be very happy to have them do so. And by the way, this was a pre-Reformation reality, not at the best of Catholic Christianity, but at its most perhaps in need of reform, let's say. The congregation could come and watch the priest engage in the prayers. And so I actually think this is a standing kind of temptation in Christian and maybe human history to let a priestly caste do the dangerous work of actually worshiping God. And I just get the sort of spillover benefits. There was a pre-Trent, pre-Reformation version of that, but we now live in a Protestant version of that, where the new priests are not the ostensible pastor, who's just the teacher now, but actually the worship leaders are the new priests. So this is a standing issue, and just like the Reformation, like radically re-involved the congregation, actually introduced the organ because it was so painful to hear people sing without one. They were like, okay, if we're going to have the congregation sing, they need some help. So the organ was introduced to like assist in congregations who are amateur musicians doing it. So I think there's a couple of things. One is I do think volume matters, and I just think you can make sound reinforcement decisions such that the sound of the people is the primary sound you hear, and it's supported very well. And this doesn't necessarily mean low sound pressure levels per se, but you adjust the mix so that what is heard as we worship is the people worshiping. And I've been in all kinds of environments where that is true, and some of them are doing very much modern worship music, but just with a different kind of philosophy of what the speakers are there for, what the amplification is there for. I think there's going to be more teaching required. So I think worship musicians, this is something that I really, I hope can happen. I have to admit, I feel a little bit of, I'm not despairing. That's not a Christian virtue, but I'm losing altitude but on my hope for this. But ideally, professional musicians would see their first vocation as enabling the song of the people. And in our time, when you do not learn how to sing or in other respects make music, in the course of your schooling or in family or cultural settings, you have to actually teach it in church. And this means taking more time to teach, while of course paying attention to that question of how much can people stretch. It's starting with what they can do, but then taking them further. And this is the third thing that we can do, is be like on the hunt for repertoire, ideally that expresses our own congregation's expression and response to what God's doing, up to and including originating music from the congregation. And right now, there's a relative handful of well-resourced and very intentional congregations that are like, one of the things we do is we have professional songwriters on our team. Right. But I was just at a retreat with a church that is bucking every trend in this way to avoid personalizing it. I'm not going to say the church, but it's a growing church in a big American city. They have like 600 worshipers, I think. It seems like they have 800 children. It's young, very young Americans, many with many, many little munchkins running around, growing through appealing to the people you might think really want modern worship. And I'm sure a lot of them do listen to a lot of modern worship. But this church has done a couple of interesting things. One is they have no professional worship leaders. They've grown to this, medium to large size church. And they've just decided we're going to let the congregation lead. And they happen to have some quite talented people in their congregation, but not necessarily Nashville level talent. And I got to be led by a couple of those folks, and it was beautiful. Like they're amateurs, but they're dedicated amateurs. They really prepare and they're ready to lead. But then they do it with very low amplification levels and with kind of limited instrumentation, so you don't fill up every frequency band. And the congregation sings. And they've actually taught them, like, we are here. Actually, they did this sermon series where they said our singing does two things. One is it just properly responds to God for his goodness. And the other is that your singing witnesses to your neighbor that there is another person who believes this. And so you owe it to your neighbor to sing out whatever affirmation of God's presence and so forth that we're singing. Like, you owe it for them to hear you sing it, because it will encourage them and kind of release hope and faith in them, which I just thought was a beautiful way to teach it. And we sang a song. They started singing it. I thought, I don't know this. I'm just going to listen. And it was this incredible setting of a kind of voicing the lament of Job, who is asking God, where are you? And are you even really my friend? And so forth. Yeah. And it turns out they had a sermon series on Job, and this guy who's at the piano the day I heard it, they kind of urged him, try writing a song that Job would sing, that we could use in worship. Now, this guy is a good piano player, but his day job, he's an engineer. Yeah. Very ordinary fellow, does not look like a rock star, cannot do the octave up thing with his voice, like just very normal musically trained person wrote this incredible song that for now only this congregation sings, and they're singing it in conjunction with the sermon series on the book of Job. That should be happening over and over and over in our congregations. And there's a kind of humility that the professional worship leaders have to adopt, that, and a servanthood, like, I'm here to serve the voice of the people, the song of the people. And what does it take? It takes teaching them. It takes listening to them. It takes gradually expanding their repertoire, expanding what we can do together musically, because there's so much, like, the more we can do together, the more dimensions of God's presence we can articulate and respond to. It's all possible. It's just that right now, everyone's kind of indexing on a handful of extremely talented and mostly sincere, not all of them, but mostly sincere, like, on stage people who are magnetic and do things none of the rest of us can do. Yeah. But it doesn't have to be that way.
All right, Andy, that's a beautiful vision of where we could take musical worship in a way that re-engages the people, that closes up this chasm between the worship leader and the congregation, and ultimately brings all of us into the presence of God. It strikes me, though, and that a lot of what you're talking about are decisions that leadership makes. The leadership of the music worship leader, the pastor, hopefully the elders and so forth, because you're talking about a different paradigm that leaders sort of have to embrace. In addition to that, Andy, and this is my final question to you, what can the average layperson do who's not in leadership, not in those rooms where it happens? What can I do as somebody to recapture and re-lean into music worship that truly engages my full sense?
Well, that's a really good question. I would start bootlegging it. That is, I know you and Jody a little bit, and I know that, like, singing is not your most natural thing to do, right?
No.
So I'm not going to tell you, like, gather in your living room and just sing, you and your spouse. I understand that's
be a very painful experience. Yeah.
I would find a few other people, including some who can kind of set the pace in a sense musically, and let's just make some music together, like totally off label. Let's. I would host musicians in your home, like there's a handful of people who make a good living at this, and the rest, they love to make music, and they almost never get to do it in a place where people are really paying attention. And this is true for performance as well. And there's a place for musical performance. We haven't talked about that aspect of it, but not all of it has to be like the music, the worship side. Yeah. But I would, I wish we had far more house parties, in a sense. I mean, that may sound like a weird thing to juxtapose with worship per se, but far more home-based opportunities for trained musicians, not necessarily professional, but trained and prepared to just make music with people. I don't know. This past weekend, I was at this retreat with this church I mentioned. They had this cellist. She teaches cello, so she gets to do it professionally. Like, I asked her I did a little bit of music myself. I said, "Oh, would you play with me?" Like, she didn't say, "Oh, well, my hourly rate is such and such," or, I only do things where we can, have this certain standard. She was just like, "Oh, that would be amazing. I'd love to contribute." Because most people who have put the time into that instrument or that practice, like, they just want invitations to do it and do it really well, and to do it with other people. And so I'd find some friends, neighbors, church members, and just start making music yourself. I
love that, Andy. And that's completely accessible. It actually strikes a chord, so to speak, in
so
me.
To speak.
I'm gonna talk to Jody, and we're gonna see about throwing a house party with other musicians to do this. I think that's a brilliant idea, completely accessible, and it just feels like the revival. I like it because it means that the revival of worship is something we all take responsibility for. It is not something we delegate simply to our leaders, but we can actually create these settings for ourselves. And I would be very hungry for an experience like you described. So I'm going to go off and work on that, and I will report back to you, dear listener, about how it went. And if you wanted to try that, I really encourage you to do that. And please then let us know here at Good Faith, how did it go? How did your house party with God and God's people go? Leave a review if you want to on where you get your podcasts, and just drop in the story there, or email us at info@redeemingbabel.org. Hey, together, it just strikes me, Andy, I love the historical picture you painted about how this is a historical temptation for us to not do the hard work of entering the presence of the living God and to rely on some consumed experience. And it strikes me that just as the first Reformation, in some sense, had to be a driver of literacy, of text-based literacy, in order to put the Bible back into the hands of the people, perhaps the next Reformation has to be about musical literacy, to put back the score of the sheet back in the hands of the people.
Amazing. Yes.
Well, may it be so.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Let's do it. We'll nail these theses on our living room walls. Andy, it's been a joy to have you again. Thank you again for sharing your wisdom and your insights.
Thank you, my friend.
All right. And listeners of Good Faith, I'm quite serious. I'm going to go do this. I'm going to try to do this, see if I can pull this off. But you do as well. And let's meet back together around the campfire to share our stories.